Hey guys, welcome back to my Animal Adventures YouTube channel, and in this episode I want to talk about some of the worst advice that I've seen given to brand new snake keepers. And if you go to a pet store and you buy a snake, there's a lot of really bad information not only coming from the pet stores, but a lot of it floating around on the internet, and that's what I want to cover today. So when I first started getting into snakes, I was hitting the pet stores trying to figure out which projects I wanted to get into and what kind of snakes to purchase. And at one particular pet store, I saw a guy sitting on a chair with a whole bunch of tubs in front of him, and he was actually picking out the snakes from the enclosure, putting them in the tubs to feed them instead of feeding the snakes directly in the enclosure. And I think that's a really big mistake. I think it's a bad idea, and here's why. Because if you take a look at some of my snakes, for example, my pastel desert ghost male here, typically when you open a tub or you come up to the enclosure, they are in feeding mode and they're ready to eat right away. And the thing about snakes is that they change modes from one mode to another. So this snake, if I put my finger right in front of that snake, he would take a bite. And the problem is by moving him, so now I'm picking up the snake and I'm moving him to another enclosure. See, now the snake is transferred from a feeding mode to a handling mode. And now that I put him in another tub to feed him, now I have to get that snake now from a handling mode back into a feeding mode. So, and I find especially with ball pythons, it's really difficult to get them to switch from the handling mode back to the feeding mode. And as a matter of fact, I think it's a lot more difficult to feed in a separate enclosure. And the idea is to move the snake to a separate enclosure so it doesn't get food aggressive in the main enclosure, but I don't think that is really an issue. You can really get around the back side of the snake, and as soon as you touch the snake, it really goes into a handling mode. And then the other problem about moving to another enclosure, say, for example, if I took the snake, moved it over here, and I did happen to get it to feed it a big rat or a mouse, and it ate it. The problem is now is you have a snake with a big rodent in its belly, and I found if you move a snake that has a freshly eaten rodent inside of his belly, that if you move him, the chance of regurgitation is really high. As a matter of fact, if I would highly recommend not moving your snakes at all after probably a day or two after they've eaten. I really like to let them sit for 3 days after they've eaten so you don't risk the chance of regurgitation. Okay, so the second biggest piece of bad advice I've seen given, especially from pet stores, is that you need a heat mat for your ball python's enclosure. And getting the heat mat without a thermostat. And I've seen it a lot of times. People take a heat mat and they'll just buy it off the shelf, put it underneath their tank, and plug it in and go. And let me tell you, those heat mats can get really hot. As a matter of fact, if you take a heat gun and you take a temperature reading of that heat mat, and if it goes above 95 degrees, you can actually permanently damage your snake. As a matter of fact, 95 degrees can make your males go sterile. So I would highly recommend, if you buy a heat mat, in addition to the heat mat, to buy a heat controller. And what I have in my racks actually is in the very back of the rack, way over here, I have heat panels. So this heat panel right here goes all the way, and the back side of the tubs is a hot spot, and it's controlled by thermostats. And I have pretty fancy thermostats. You can actually buy a more inexpensive thermostat. They sell these little jump start thermostats similar to this, and they're not very expensive. And I actually had some bad experience with a heat pad early on. Before I actually got into snakes, I had a few tarantulas, and I bought one of those heat mats thinking it was temperature controlled. And let me tell you, most of them, some of them say they're controlled within a certain range, but they're not really all controlled within that narrow of a range. I guess they can get really hot and they can damage your reptiles. In my case, it actually damaged my spider. I lost my spider because I had one of the spiders that burrow into the substrate, and I had a really hot heat mat that was uncontrolled under that spider, and I lost that spider, unfortunately. But if you look on the internet, you look around a lot of the snake forums, and a lot of people, I'd say the #1 problem with snakes is people buying heat mats without a thermostat, putting them under their tank or their enclosure and actually burning the belly of the snake, and the scales are coming off and the bellies are turning red, and it's a serious problem. And I think that's the #1 piece of information that's missing from pet stores, is that when they sell those heat mats, I think they should be selling at the same time some kind of thermostat. Okay, so speaking of those heat mats that go under the tank that need a thermostat, there's another thing that a lot of people are kind of tricked into, I would say. You definitely do not want to get one of the heat rocks. So the heat rocks are really for lizards, and they get really hot. They're too hot for reptiles, and they're not really controlled. So I would definitely not get one of the heat rocks for your pet snake. And I'd say, in addition to the heat pads underneath the tank burning snakes, I'd say probably the #2 things that really burns the bellies of the snakes are the heat rocks. Okay, since we're talking about heating the reptiles enclosure, another thing we should talk about is the heat lamp that goes on top. And a lot of people use the heat lamp from above. Sometimes they'll use it in conjunction with the heat mat underneath the tank. And the thing you have to really watch about your heat lamps is that they can get too hot. And what you really want to do is you want to take a temperature gun, take the temperature directly under the heat lamp, and I would highly recommend getting some kind of a dimmer on that heat lamp to control the temperature. You can dim it down a little bit to really dial in the temperature. And what I actually have, we have a red-eyed green tree frog upstairs in the kitchen, and we have a heat lamp on that enclosure. And what we actually have is I can't remember the brand name of the thermostat, but it actually dims the light as it reaches a certain temperature, and it kind of goes through different phases of dimming to precisely control that heat lamp. So another piece of bad advice I've seen floating around out there is to put too much humidity into your ball python enclosure. And really, I don't think they need that much humidity. As a matter of fact, if you have too much humidity, you could run the risk of your substrate starting to mold. And then if your substrate molds, it's usually an indication you're running the risk of your ball python getting a respiratory infection. And I've seen a lot of people with homemade racks where they don't have enough ventilation in their tubs. Their substrate starts to mold, and sure enough, they have 3 or 4 snakes that are kind of wheezing, and you can kind of hear it when they have the respiratory infection, and they have some like saliva coming out of their mouth, and you can kind of see the slime up on the sides of the tubs, and that's really a problem. And then you really need to go after it and treat it with like an F10 vapor. And I've actually had some respiratory infections, and I think it was because of other factors, not necessarily from the high humidity, but I would really be cautious of a high humidity in ball python tubs. And let me kind of show you my ideal amount of humidity that I like in my tubs. I really like to, well, if they're coming up on a shed, I'll really kind of soak it down and give them a lot more humidity just as a boost during the shed. But after they've shed, I really like it to dry out, and ideally for me, I like it a little bit dry on top, and then like an inch or 2 down to have it wet underneath. You don't want it standing in water, but you want enough humidity in there to where it doesn't really break apart, and it makes a solid mat that they can climb around on, and it almost acts like one solid piece. If it gets too dry, it breaks up into almost they can kind of dig through it, almost it doesn't really form a good mat if it's too dry, and I like it to form a mat, give it enough moisture to where it forms a mat. And I would say something like this is probably ideal. I don't have my big snake in there. She's breeding with Lucy, but you can see it's really dry up on top, and if I dig down into it, it's a slightly different color underneath, and this is where all the moisture is underneath, and it's dry up on top. And that seems, for me, the perfect amount of humidity where it can slowly bring up the humidity in here and not completely saturate all the air with moisture. And I think that's perfect for ball pythons, except when they go into the shed. And when they go into the shed, I think you really need to boost it just to get them through the shed and then drop down the humidity again. Okay, so here's another piece of bad information that's kind of floating around. Actually, I've seen this. I bought a snake, and when I bought one of my snakes, they were actually feeding it once a month. And some people say you only need to feed snakes once a month, and let me tell you, most snakes need to eat once a week, especially if they're not really big snakes. I have my big snake Lucy, and she weighs like between 50 and 60 pounds, and I can feed her probably 5 or 6 pounds worth of rats all at once, or a big rabbit or something like that, and that's probably the only snake that can go for a whole month without eating. But I'd say typically most snakes that are smaller, that are eating regular size mice and rats, they definitely need to eat at least once a week. So another piece of really bad advice that I've seen given, and that is that you need to force feed your ball python, where you take a rodent and you put it in the mouth of your snake, hoping that it will eat. And let me tell you, ball pythons can fast for a long time, and it's just the natural part of keeping ball pythons. I've actually had ball pythons go on a fast for up to 8 months, and it's even hard to believe that a snake could go for 8 months without eating and be perfectly fine. And a lot of new snake keepers, I think they really freak out that an animal, it just doesn't even seem real that an animal can go for so long without eating and be perfectly fine. And you just want to make sure they have water for those 8 months, and just keep trying to feed week after week, just offering the food, and eventually that snake will come back on food. Let me tell you that I've never seen a snake starve itself to death from not eating. And the only time you really want to assist feed is when you have a brand new ball python hatchling and it's trying to eat for the very first time, and sometimes it just won't eat, and that's the only time that you really need to assist feed, to actually tell that hatchling that, hey, this is food and this is how you eat it. Sometimes they're a little bit slow and they just can't catch on. But other than that, you definitely never want to force feed your ball python. Okay, so that wraps up the worst advice that I've ever seen given to snake keepers. If you're thinking about getting a ball python, or if you have a ball python or other reptile, be sure to avoid these pitfalls. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.